This is a CNA podcast.
Welcome back to the Climate Conversations with me, Julie Yu. Of late, we are seeing the twin terrors of supply chain disruptions and climate change affecting something very important to human survival: food. In this episode, we want to talk about seafood, specifically fish. Where do our supplies of fish come from? Especially since fish prices have risen from our traditional sources in Malaysia and Indonesia. And as waters get warmer and the weather gets more unpredictable, how can the world better protect its seafood supplies? What does it mean when businesses talk about sustainable seafood? And what are the biggest problems we face, and how do we do better? With me to dive deeper into the issues is Chester Gan, the Responsible Seafood Program Officer at WWF-Singapore. Hi, Chester. Welcome.
Hi, Julie. Thanks for having me.
So was there a particular moment that inspired you to get involved in tackling the issue of sustainability in seafood?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I've always been interested in marine conservation. That's always been my main interest in terms of my educational background. My background is a marine scientist. I was trained in environmental science. I have a master's in oceanography. But specifically on seafood, I was taking opportunities as it came. Before I joined WWF, I was doing research for shark and ray supply chain, looking at Singapore, trying to map and figure out where it's coming from. But with that particular study on shark and ray, there's actually one image that kept sticking in mind. A huge part of that was having interviews with your wet market store owners, with your fishery merchants. And the first few times I went down to the port, I remember very clearly, it's still in my head right now, having this conversation with an old uncle about his stock. And right next to me was a massive pile of stingray carcasses up to my mid-thigh, maybe 200 and 300 portions. And it's only then it really struck me the enormity of what I'm working with. This is a small country we have, right? Our consumption is about 22 kg of seafood per capita. It's not even compared to Korea, like 70 plus kg per capita. And there's like on a daily basis, this amount from one store for domestic consumption. So if you just multiply that, it just feels like the oceans are definitely
It's a lot.
in trouble at some point, yeah.
Exactly. Like you said, we know that Singapore is a seafood-loving nation, yet over 90% of the seafood are actually imported from overseas. Could you perhaps walk us through how fish or seafood get on our plates? Is it a lot different from other forms of food supplies like meat or vegetable?
Well, we do go through the same agri-food cultural systems. We largely import from the region. I think about good 60% are coming from Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. It could be either wild caught or farm. Indonesia is the second largest exporter of seafood in the world. Singapore is just getting that from these areas and going through the fishery ports, going to the wet markets, or directly imported to your retailers and restaurants, and that's how it gets to your plate. We do have a domestic sector for aquaculture. We don't really have a significant one for wild-caught fisheries. So most of our domestic production is from the aquaculture side, about 110 sea-based farms, adding land-based farms maybe 130, 140. But like you said, the production volumes at this point in time are still very small, although with the Singapore Food Agency's 30 by 30 goal, there's a lot more push to expand that to 3 times its size, 4 times its size here.
More than 5 years ago, I think it was 2016 to be exact, a report by WWF revealed that 75% of the seafood consumed in Singapore is unsustainable and they're irresponsibly fished or farmed. Can you tell me a little bit about the difference between a sustainable farm and one that's not?
Okay, when it comes to sustainability, there's a common misconception that we just look at species. It helps to really boil it down to species. It's easier as a piece of knowledge for consumers. But the unfortunate fact is that when we're looking at sustainability of seafood, it includes the production method. So in terms of wild-caught fisheries, is how it's being caught, whether it's using devices that increases bycatch or decreases bycatch, which is catching non-targeted species, which is obviously not something that we want. The production method is important, but also the location itself, because fish stocks of the same species could differ widely in the health between different areas. So when we look at sustainability of seafood, it's a combination of these factors. How it's produced in farms, whether you are taking into account whether you're mitigating environmental impacts, whether you're mitigating social impacts, and that could differ on farm to farm level. So looking at species specifically is a little bit too generalized. That's the lens we need to look at even as a consumer. When I'm looking for sustainable products, I need to consider these other factors.
Okay, so has the situation improved since then?
It's hard to tell. There's one huge challenge that we face in Singapore, that's data. So data transparency is one problem. We need to know these metrics, but unfortunately, it is not just a Singapore-based issue. Regionally, there is this opacity in the data supply chain. That awareness is also missing because that data is missing. I'm a Singaporean. I've born and raised in Singapore. I've had seafood my whole life. Unfortunately, I'm one of those who wouldn't be able to tell, especially if it's in a fillet form and I didn't buy it myself, what species it is. So that's the same kind of problem that consumers face. You don't know what you're eating half the time, you just know it's fish, and then you're just eating it. Our national foods as well, curry fish head, sambal stingray, woven into our identity. But unfortunately, on the consumer's end, because of the lack of data that we have, awareness is just a big issue. So if I just want to know where is it from, if you look at the label, it could say product of Malaysia, but it doesn't tell you whether it's wild caught or farmed. It doesn't tell you whether it's just imported from Malaysia, but it could possibly be landed in Indonesia and then sent there. So you don't actually know the particular fish stock it's from or the farm that it's coming from. When I was talking to wet market stall owners, I asked them why they don't have this information, why maybe they know the country, but even then it's a 50% chance they say, oh, I don't know, India, Malaysia, likely that's coming from, but they're not certain about it. There's no credentials, there's no proof behind it. And I asked them, do you not ask these questions? Is this not your concern? And for them, most common response I get, which really drove it home, is that the customers don't ask. If the customers don't ask, why would I want to possibly jeopardize this business relationship? It doesn't give me any profit margin. There's nothing gained on my part. It's extra work. But what we see is some optimistic signs that there is a push from the business side, from the consumer side, in having more interest. So customers asking, and collectively, if we do have a consumer base that's asking these questions, then it starts sending that signal up the chain. So the situation will improve.
Oh, interesting. Given Singapore is highly dependent on imports for its food requirements, we certainly are very vulnerable to fluctuations in food supply, prices, and food safety. Tell us about what WWF-SG is doing to ensure sustainable supply and market demand for responsible seafood.
Yeah, that's a great question. What we're trying to do to forge a more responsible seafood future for Singapore, we tackle it in the supply side. Seafood work is complex. You need to look at different details. There's so many species, there's so many products, this processing involved, supply chains are very fragmented and very different. As I mentioned, the SFA's 30 by 30 goal includes a huge planned expansion of the local agriculture sector so that we can meet 30% of Singapore's nutritional needs. On that front, we try to work with the local farms in order to expand their capacity and ensure that while they're expanding this sector, it's done with sustainability principles in mind. So this could be, for example, we facilitate their move through what we call agriculture improvement projects, or AIPs for short. AIPs are not a new initiative. The WWF network, marine conservation organizations across the world are working on AIPs because they're a very general catch-all phrase that look at how to improve a farm. And for WWF, we use these projects to work closely with them to look at various aspects like fish feed, fish health, energy use on a farm, what the impact is on surrounding ecosystems, and to help them become more environmentally and socially responsible. And the benchmark we use is the Aquaculture Stewardship Council standard, which is the ASCE certification itself. So we try and prepare them because this is a rigorous, globally recognized standard. It has very strong and very detailed metrics on how to move towards responsibly producing. So we use that certification as a benchmark. We develop a gap on where their current practices are to those standards. We help them develop an improvement plan that is specific to the farm itself to bridge that gap. And throughout this whole process, it's a very collaborative effort, a very close partnership where we provide expertise, we provide assistance, we do progress monitoring so that we are sure as well, because we are an NGO, when we're looking at conservation, we are sure that the farm is moving towards sustainability.
For those of us who are not so familiar with aqua farming in Singapore, perhaps can you tell us how many are out there, what kinds of species are grown domestically, and at what volumes?
Yes, we actually just completed a study. I will need to look at it again to fully familiarize myself with the actual volumes. But we have around 110 sea-based farms. We have also up-and-coming farms on land that are using ROS systems. I recently spoke to a farm that is trying to farm salmon, cold water species in a tropical climate like Singapore, and that's possible because of these close containment systems. It's actively growing. It's a very fluctuating ecosystem. So, but we have largely in Singapore produced barramundi, so that's your Asian sea bass. We produce coral trout. We have shrimp farms in Singapore. There are quite a few different species, but they're mostly locally consumed. So part of our study that we did recently was also to look at how they were selling their products and which sectors. about 3% will go into exports, and a lot will go into your retailers, your restaurants. So that's the current state of aquafarm. But it's going to change drastically in the next 10 years with the plans that the Singapore government has and the way it's being restructured, the aquaculture sector. So what I'm saying might be completely obsolete in a couple of years. Yeah.
But if we look at right now, the rising inflation from feed to fuel, is that having any impact on local fish farms?
Yes, definitely. The fish farms need input, right? They need farm, they need seed stock to grow out and be able to sell it as well. So rising inflation are all cost considerations for them, which is why to help them move to sustainability, especially for smaller farms, they need that support either from industry or from government to try and transition to practices that are more sustainable. But for them, cost is a huge factor. They are competing not just locally, highly competitive market, but also competing with aquaculture farms that are obviously with cheaper inputs from Malaysia or from Indonesia. So it's a highly competitive environment. Cost, they recognize the need for it. Recently, we had a workshop with aquaculture farmers in Singapore. They talk about water quality, how it's affecting you. They know environmentally they need to consider these things. It's just that cost considerations is still a key factor for them. Survival is still a key factor for them.
Hi, my name is Sarah Alcaldi, and I'm the host of a new podcast called Money Talks. Yes, we will be talking about money, but more than that, we'll also be talking about life, personal choices, lucky breaks, and how money is the thread running through it all. So look out for our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.
I remember there was a controversial Netflix documentary, Seaspiracy, which had a single call to action for its viewers, which was stop eating fish. So where do you stand on that?
For me, this is a personal opinion. I think that call for stop eating fish was a little misguided. There are huge portions of the global population that depend on fish as their active protein, their most essential protein in Indonesia. It doesn't account for some on-the-ground realities, and we live in a region where a lot of those communities are like that. So just saying stop eating fish, then what's the alternative? That's difficult to answer amongst most of the mainstream meat products. Fish in general, it is actually more resource efficient. It's a feed conversion ratio, and this term is used to see like how much feed you have to put in to gain like 1 kg of animal weight. But the feed conversion ratio is the lowest. So on some level, actually fish is a better protein, but it needs to be consumed in moderation. It needs to have these considerations of whether it's impacting the ocean health, whether it's impacting social communities. You need to know the local context of where you're consuming. In Singapore, we do have a little bit more choice. So we do look at moderation in diet. We also look at planet-based diets. That's something that WWF pushes.
Yeah, moderation, that's hard to define, right? Is there a limit to the amount of fish we should eat per week? Keep the oceans replenished? I don't know, maybe once a week? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it's hard to put a number, like you say. What I was looking at is less of excessively eating. For example, your seafood buffets, or you're one of those where you're just basically getting more and more lobster just for the sake of it and spending. So that's where I was looking at. So not so much a quantity of how much you eat a week, but just knowing that are you consuming just for the sake of consuming at some point. So that's what I mean by moderation. Yeah.
Okay, so if we are to consume seafood, are there some of the species that are at risk of becoming unsustainable that we should think twice about before eating? What are the preferred sort of eating choice, would you say?
Yeah, that's why I said we focus on certified products because looking at species level is kind of problematic. I could be telling you, yes, you can eat this particular mussel, but perhaps if it's sourced from this different area, it actually causes a lot more problems than some other area. So you need to know the other metrics before you can make decisions based on what you can consume. But there are a couple more broad-based ones that are just threatened worldwide that obviously you should avoid. One example being your shark and ray species. IUCN just last year released a huge reassessment of their red list, where they're looking at the assessment of the species at a global level, how threatened it is, basically. So there are different categories to that, being no concern to critically endangered or even extinct. And what they found was for sharks and rays, we had roughly 1/3 of the species of sharks and rays currently in danger of extinction. And that's the second highest animal group behind amphibians. And then the second thing is, in the critically endangered portion, we had a tripling of the number of species, and a lot of that are in ray species. So sharks get a lot of attention generally, and that's a good thing in some way, even though we still see a decline. But rays, and especially in Singapore, we do consume quite a bit of rays. They get a lot less attention. They're not commonly consumed in other countries. They're also something that we don't know as much information about. So these are species you should just avoid at all costs at this point in time. So there are certain things that you can avoid completely, but just looking at species itself is not sufficient. You need to know how it's caught, how it's farmed.
Okay, Chester, so before I let you go, what do you think the next 10 to 20 years of aquaculture production might look like? Will the composition, farmed species, do you think it will shift?
Globally, within the next 2 years, it's going to be aquaculture and the expansion because of the fish stocks that we have and how we are already almost at the maximum limit of fishing, that it's going to be aquaculture producing at a global level. In Singapore, it's still a little bit fluid. I can't really say for sure the next 20 years. There's a lot of focus on high-tech farming and also obviously on more profitable products, so your luxury items. But there are farms that I've spoken to that want to cater to the local market as well. So your wet markets, they want to funnel to the basic consumer rather than your hotels, your restaurants, your bigger markets. It could change quite a bit. There could be more fish that you see that you're buying for the wet markets, for the farms in Singapore. But it really depends at this point in time. I know the government also wants to push for domestic consumption, right? So there is a factor that they also want more species that are consumed locally. Right now, that is the case, but it's also more for the higher end markets. So there could be a shift. For consumers, one of the key things we really can do is start to create the buzz. Collectively, we have purchasing power. We vote with our wallets. So not just supporting companies that are investing in sustainability, have robust sustainability policies, but also certified products, right? Certified products, they have gone through the whole process. They are being audited. The certification scheme does everything for you. It looks at the metrics. You don't even have to bother about that if you need to know. Then they ensure that the product with that label actually came from the fishery or the farm itself. So certified products, so MSC, ASC products, you look at them and you use that, if you can afford it, of course, to support, because there's a gap because of the lack of supply in the local sphere. So that's why WWF wants to create more certified farms in our local aquaculture sector, because with the logistics chain, it might also be comparable in price and easier for consumers to take it up. By using our wallet to buy like certified products and supporting that, but also asking questions, sustainability information is key to us making smart purchasing decisions, and we want to know that. And why I say that as well is we did a study, WWF-Singapore and Accenture last year, looking at the consumer base in Singapore, looking at how they viewed sustainability. It was not just on seafood, it was generally on sustainability across a wide various sectors. But what we found was that not only 41% of them identified themselves as devoted to the environment, and that's a pretty strong term, but 75% said they want to behave more sustainably. They just lack the avenues and options. So there is this gap between current behavior and where they seem to, the attitudes to sustainability. And so bridging that gap could really help to build momentum to transforming the whole seafood industry.
All right, Chester, thank you very much for your time. It's been so insightful.
Thanks so much, Julie, as well. It's great chatting with you.
Special thanks to my guest, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Do remember to subscribe and like this podcast so you know when a new episode drops. You can find CNA's climate and sustainability coverage online at cna.asia.
The team behind this podcast is Audrey Wan, Jacqueline Chan, Daniel Lee, and Crispina Robert.
And I'm Julie Yu, signing off.
Experience the life-changing benefits of automated insulin delivery with the T-Slim X2 insulin pump from Tandem Diabetes Care. Snack while you meal prep, doze off on the couch, wear it fashionably or discreetly. You can do it all with the #1 rated automated insulin delivery system according to a DQ&A patient panel. Get started at tandemdiabetes.com. RX only, indicated for patients with type 1 diabetes 6 years and older. Warning, Control-IQ technology should not be used by people under age 6 or who use less than 10 units of insulin per day or who weigh less than 55 pounds. Safety info available at tandemdiabetes.com/safety info.